Years earlier, beneath the glittering chandeliers of Ashcombe Palace, 50 noblewomen had stood in gowns worth fortunes while a lonely little boy struggled to tie his shoe with only one hand. They had admired the Duke's wealth, measured one another's beauty, and waited for an opportunity to impress the most powerful nobleman in England. None had noticed the frightened child sitting quietly at the edge of the ballroom. Then one village schoolteacher wearing a simple cream dress had crossed the polished floor, knelt before him without hesitation, and helped him finish the knot himself. That single moment had changed far more than one afternoon. It had healed a broken boy, restored a grieving father's faith, uncovered a murderer, and transformed Ashcombe into a place where kindness mattered more than rank. 11 peaceful years had passed since that unforgettable day. Spring returned to the Ashcombe estate wrapped in blossoms and birdsong. White roses climbed the palace walls where ivy once struggled through neglected stone, orchards stretched toward distant hills, and village children raced across green meadows built where abandoned fields had once stood. Travelers no longer journeyed there merely to admire the wealth of an ancient ducal family. They came to witness something rarer, a noble house whose gates welcomed orphans, veterans, widows, laborers, and strangers with equal warmth. Throughout Britain, people no longer called Lucian Ashcombe the Cold Duke. They called him the Kind Duke, a title he treasured far more than any inherited honor. At 48, Lucian's commanding presence remained unmistakable. His clean-shaven face had gained only a few distinguished silver strands near his temples, while his steady gray-blue eyes carried wisdom earned through hardship rather than age. Every decision he made reflected the quiet influence of the woman who now walked beside him through every challenge. Rosalie, 36, had become beloved far beyond Ashcombe's borders. Schools bearing her guidance flourished across neighboring counties. Clinics cared for poor families who could never have afforded physicians. Young teachers trained under her example before returning to forgotten villages carrying books instead of pride. Yet despite the admiration surrounding her, she remained the same gentle woman who instinctively noticed lonely hearts before important titles. Their home overflowed with joyful chaos. 10-year-old Charlotte possessed her mother's compassion and often disappeared into the kitchens carrying extra bread for hungry workers before anyone asked. 8-year-old William explored every stable, workshop, and orchard on the estate, returning daily with muddy boots, endless questions, and impossible adventures. 5-year-old Emily ruled every hallway with laughter bright enough to soften even the sternest steward. Their voices echoed through Ashcombe like music, filling rooms that had once known only silence. Only Nathaniel understood how precious that laughter truly was. Now 20 years old, he had grown into a striking young nobleman whose quiet confidence drew admiration wherever he traveled. His missing left arm remained hidden beneath expertly tailored coats, while the slight weakness in his leg appeared only after long days spent walking through villages rather than riding in comfortable carriages. Instead of allowing his childhood injuries to define him, he transformed them into purpose. He founded schools for disabled children who had once been turned away elsewhere. He financed workshops teaching injured veterans skilled trades. He visited hospitals without announcing his rank, speaking with frightened patients until hope slowly returned to their eyes. Across Britain, people praised Lord Nathaniel Ashcombe as proof that courage often arrived wearing invisible scars. Yet every triumph concealed a loneliness he never shared. Marriage proposals reached Ashcombe almost weekly. Noble families eagerly introduced accomplished daughters possessing remarkable beauty, impeccable manners, and fortunes capable of strengthening any alliance. The conversations always began warmly. Elegant young women admired Nathaniel's intelligence, his generosity, and the future awaiting any woman who married the heir to Ashcombe. Then came the subtle moment that repeated itself with heartbreaking consistency. Their eyes drifted toward his empty sleeve. Smiles hesitated. Polite excuses followed. Within days each family quietly withdrew its interest, inventing convenient reasons that spared everyone embarrassment except the young man left behind. Nathaniel never expressed bitterness. When Charlotte once asked why another engagement had suddenly ended, he merely smiled and replied, "No one should promise forever if fear already lives in their heart." Rosalie heard those words from the doorway. For one fleeting instant she saw not her grown son but the lonely child who had once believed nobody would ever notice him beyond his disability. She reached for Lucian's hand beneath the dinner table. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Several weeks later, Nathaniel traveled to one of the newest village schools established through Rosalie's charitable foundation. The modest brick building overlooked rolling green fields alive with spring flowers. Children recited lessons through open windows while fresh paint still scented newly finished classrooms. Villagers gathered to celebrate the opening, including wealthy benefactors whose polished carriages lined the narrow lane outside the school. As Nathaniel inspected the library, sudden shouting erupted near the entrance. A spirited horse startled at the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, jerking violently against its harness. A young woman carrying a wooden crate filled with heavy medical books and glass medicine bottles stumbled sideways as frightened visitors rushed clear of the animal. The crate slipped from her grasp. Leather-bound volumes scattered across the muddy road. Fragile bottles rolled beneath carriage wheels. Wealthy guests stepped carefully around the mess, lifting expensive gowns and polished boots rather than bending to help. The young woman immediately knelt, trying desperately to gather everything before the bottles shattered. Her simple blue traveling dress became stained with mud. A loose strand escaped her neatly pinned chestnut hair as she reached for another book beyond her grasp. Several gentlemen glanced toward her before continuing their conversations, unwilling to dirty spotless gloves. Nathaniel did not hesitate. Without considering who might be watching, he lowered himself beside her despite the weakness in his leg. Using his single hand with practiced patience, he collected each scattered volume one at a time, balancing them carefully against his shoulder before placing them gently back into the crate. When a medicine bottle rolled beneath a carriage, he calmly stretched forward and retrieved it before the wheel crushed it. The young woman looked up, surprised. She possessed thoughtful green eyes filled with quiet intelligence rather than fashionable confidence, delicate features untouched by vanity, and an expression carrying both gratitude and unspoken sadness. "Thank you," she said softly. "Most people only notice what you've lost." Nathaniel smiled with the same warmth his mother had once shown him. "My mother taught me to notice what people are still carrying inside." For a moment neither moved. Around them the hurried world continued without understanding that something extraordinary had quietly begun beside an overturned crate in the village mud. Standing beneath the schoolhouse porch, unseen by either of them, Rosalie watched the entire exchange. Her eyes slowly filled with tears as memories flooded back to the ballroom where she had first knelt before a frightened little boy. Lucien stepped beside her, following her gaze toward their son and the young physician's daughter still smiling through wind-tossed hair. Rosalie's fingers tightened around his hand, and her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Lucien," she murmured, "our son's story has just begun, and this time, destiny has remembered exactly where it started." Nathaniel found reasons to visit Rosalie's village schools more often than duty required, though he never admitted even to himself why the journeys had become the brightest part of each week. Every visit revealed the same young physician's daughter moving quietly among ordinary people with sleeves rolled above her wrists, tending scraped knees, listening to worried mothers, or carrying medicine baskets heavier than anyone expected her graceful frame to bear. She accepted no payment from widows, refused praise from grateful laborers, and disappeared before public speeches could celebrate her generosity. The villagers spoke of her with affection, yet none seemed to know very much about her beyond her name. Miss Eleanor Whitmore was 22, beautiful without trying to be beautiful, with thoughtful green eyes that noticed suffering before comfort, soft chestnut hair gathered into a practical Victorian knot, and calm hands that never trembled while treating frightened patients. She had been raised by her widowed grandfather after losing both parents at a young age. Her father had been a respected physician whose sudden death remained surrounded by unanswered questions, while her mother had followed him only months later, leaving Eleanor with little beyond medical books, quiet determination, and an unwavering belief that healing strangers honored the family she had lost. Nathaniel admired her long before he understood he was falling in love. Their conversations began with books, drifted toward village improvements, and eventually settled into comfortable silences requiring no clever words. Eleanor never stared at his missing arm. She asked practical questions when she genuinely needed help, then thanked him exactly as she thanked everyone else. Once, while crossing a muddy stream on uneven stones, Nathaniel slipped slightly because of his weakened leg. Before he could apologize, Eleanor simply offered her shoulder with a cheerful smile. "Everyone leans on someone eventually," she said. He laughed quietly. "I spent years pretending I never needed to. Then your mother taught you wisely." "My mother taught me kindness," Nathaniel answered. "Life taught me humility." From that afternoon onward, their friendship deepened naturally. Charlotte adored Eleanor almost immediately, following her through gardens while learning the names of medicinal flowers. William insisted upon carrying medicine baskets despite dropping them nearly every journey. Little Emily refused bedtime unless Eleanor had first read her a story whenever she visited Ashcombe. Rosalie watched the growing affection with quiet joy, recognizing familiar patterns she had once lived herself. Lucien noticed something else. Nathaniel smiled differently now. The guarded expression that had hidden disappointment after every broken courtship slowly disappeared whenever Eleanor entered a room. One evening Lucien found Rosalie standing beside the ballroom window where their own story had begun years before. "He looks happier," Lucien whispered. Rosalie smiled. "He looks hopeful. I had forgotten those were different things." She rested her head lightly against his shoulder. "So had you once." Meanwhile, beyond the peaceful villages surrounding Ashcombe, another pair of eyes had begun following Eleanor's every movement. Lord Victor Blackmore possessed none of his younger sister Vivian's vanity, yet he surpassed her in patience, intelligence, and cruelty. At 45 he commanded immense wealth through companies supplying medical equipment and medicines to hospitals across Britain. Society praised him as a generous philanthropist funding modern healthcare. Newspapers admired his charitable donations. Politicians welcomed his influence. Only a handful of people had ever suspected the truth. Inferior surgical instruments had failed inside crowded operating rooms. Contaminated medicines had quietly claimed lives that should have been saved. Hospital officials willing to ask difficult questions received promotions elsewhere, generous payments, or unexpected silence forever. Years earlier, one physician had refused every bribe. Dr. Edward Whitmore, Eleanor's father. He had gathered evidence proving Victor knowingly sold dangerous equipment while falsifying safety records. Days before presenting his findings publicly, he died in what authorities declared an unfortunate carriage accident. His research disappeared. Witnesses changed their testimony. The investigation ended. Victor believed one mistake remained: Edward's daughter. Rumors suggested the missing evidence had never truly vanished. Someone had hidden copies before the doctor's death. Victor became convinced Eleanor possessed them, even if she did not realize it herself. From the shadows, his agents began watching every letter she received, every road she traveled, every conversation she held. Eleanor noticed only small changes at first. A stranger lingering outside the village clinic. Footprints beneath her bedroom window after rain. A rider disappearing whenever she looked directly toward distant hills. She dismissed each incident as imagination until one evening she returned to her grandfather's cottage and discovered drawers standing open, family portraits disturbed, and medical journals scattered across the floor. Nothing valuable had been stolen. Only her father's old notebooks had been searched. Her grandfather's face turned pale. "He has found us," the old man whispered. Eleanor stared at him in confusion. Before she could ask whom he meant, he unlocked a weathered oak chest hidden beneath loose floorboards. Inside rested sealed journals, faded hospital ledgers, and a leather envelope tied with blue ribbon. "I prayed you would never need these," he said. "Your father died protecting them." Nathaniel arrived moments later after noticing smoke absent from the cottage chimney. Finding the frightened old man in the open chest, he listened as decades of buried truth emerged piece by piece. When Eleanor finished speaking, silence settled over the tiny room. She looked toward Nathaniel with frightened eyes for the first time since they had met. "I don't want anyone else hurt because of me." Nathaniel stepped closer. "You won't face this alone." Outside, hidden among the trees beyond the cottage, a well-dressed rider lowered his spyglass after witnessing the conversation through the window. Without another glance, he turned his horse toward London carrying news that Lord Victor Blackmore had awaited for 11 years. At last, the heir of Ashcombe had chosen the one woman powerful men feared more than armies, because she unknowingly carried the truth capable of destroying an empire built upon blood. And somewhere beyond the darkening hills, Victor smiled, believing fate had finally favored him. Nathaniel scarcely left Eleanor's side after learning the truth about her father's death. What had begun as quiet admiration now deepened into unwavering devotion, not born from pity but from respect. Every morning he accompanied her to isolated cottages where feverish children waited for medicine, elderly widows struggled through lonely winters, and injured laborers hid their pain to avoid losing precious wages. Eleanor treated each patient with the same calm kindness she had shown on the day their books had scattered across the muddy schoolyard. Nathaniel often wondered how someone carrying so much sorrow could still make others feel safe. One crisp spring afternoon they rode together through the northern villages, delivering fresh medical supplies collected from Ashcombe's charitable clinics. Rolling green fields stretched toward distant forests, and sunlight shimmered across clear streams winding beneath ancient stone bridges. The countryside appeared peaceful, yet Nathaniel noticed Eleanor glancing behind them more often than usual. "You've been watching the road since we left," he said gently. She hesitated before answering. "I keep feeling we're being followed." Nathaniel slowed his horse and quietly surveyed the empty lane. Nothing moved except swaying branches and distant sheep grazing beyond low stone walls. I don't see anyone. I know. Her voice remained calm, but her fingers tightened around the reins. That's what frightens me. They continued without another word. Far beyond the hills, hidden among towering pines, 6 mounted riders watched them through the trees. Each man wore dark traveling coats without family insignias. Their leader unfolded a small map before speaking only 3 words. Take her alive. The ambush came sooner than either expected. As Nathaniel and Eleanor entered a narrow woodland pass, frightened birds exploded from the branches overhead. Before Nathaniel could react, masked horsemen burst from both sides of the trail. Their horses thundered across the forest floor, cutting off every escape. Eleanor's frightened mare reared violently. Nathaniel, she cried. He urged his own horse between Eleanor and the attackers. Ride. She hesitated only a heartbeat before turning toward a narrow forest path. Nathaniel blocked the riders long enough for her to disappear among the trees, then spurred after her. Branches whipped across his face as the chase plunged deeper into unfamiliar woodland. Dark clouds gathered with astonishing speed. Within minutes, warm spring sunlight vanished beneath towering storm clouds. Wind howled through the forest canopy. Thunder rolled across distant mountains. Heavy rain mixed with sleet, turning narrow trails into dangerous ribbons of mud. Eleanor's horse stumbled first. The frightened animal regained its footing, but precious seconds were lost. Nathaniel caught up beside her. They're still behind us. I know. Another crash of thunder shook the forest. Ahead, the narrow path emerged onto an old wooden bridge spanning a roaring mountain river swollen by days of rain. The ancient structure creaked ominously beneath the growing storm. We have no choice, Nathaniel shouted. Together they urged their horses forward. Halfway across, lightning struck a towering pine beside the riverbank. The burning tree crashed directly onto the bridge with a deafening crack. Ancient support beams shattered instantly. The bridge collapsed beneath them. Horse, riders, and splintered timber plunged into the icy torrent below. Nathaniel struck the freezing water with breathtaking force. The current seized him immediately, spinning him through shattered beams and broken branches. His injured legs screamed with pain as submerged logs battered his body. Fighting the current with one arm seemed almost impossible. Then he heard Eleanor scream. She surfaced only yards away before disappearing beneath foaming water again. Without hesitation, Nathaniel forced himself toward her. Every stroke demanded enormous effort, yet he refused to surrender. At last his hand caught her cloak just as another wave dragged her downstream. Together they crashed against a tangled mass of fallen trees wedged across the river. The natural barrier stopped their bodies but trapped them beneath twisting branches. Ice-cold water surged around their waists while broken timber pinned their escape. Nathaniel pushed Eleanor onto the highest log before pulling himself beside her, both gasping through exhaustion. We're alive, Eleanor whispered. For now. The storm intensified. Rain hammered the forest relentlessly while daylight faded beneath thick clouds. Every attempt to free themselves failed. Nathaniel's single arm lacked the strength to move the massive waterlogged branches imprisoning them. Eleanor's breathing gradually became shallow, each breath accompanied by visible pain. My heart, she admitted quietly. Nathaniel looked at her with alarm. We have to keep you warm. He removed his soaked coat and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders despite the freezing air. Minutes later, another sound echoed through the forest. Not thunder. Howls. Oh, hungry. Closing in. Nathaniel slowly turned toward the riverbank. 6 gray wolves emerged silently between rain-soaked trees. Thin from a difficult winter, they watched the trapped pair with cautious yellow eyes. Their leader stepped closer, nose testing the wind. Eleanor instinctively reached for Nathaniel. They're starving. I know. He searched desperately for anything useful. Only broken branches floated nearby. Nathaniel pulled one free, gripping it like a crude staff. Standing upon the unstable logs required every ounce of balance his weakened leg could provide. He positioned himself between Eleanor and the approaching pack. You should climb behind me. You only have one arm. I still have one more than they expected. The wolves advanced. One lunged suddenly. Nathaniel swung the heavy branch with astonishing force, striking the animal across its shoulder. It retreated, growling angrily. Another attacked from the opposite side. He barely drove it back before slipping on the soaked timber. Pain shot through his injured leg, yet he refused to fall. The pack circled patiently. Waiting. Testing. Eleanor watched with tears filling her eyes. You can't keep this up. I don't intend to. What do you mean? I'm only trying to keep them busy. For what? Nathaniel smiled despite exhaustion. My father always taught me. He paused, listening. Hoofbeats. Distant. Growing louder. That Ashcombs never stopped searching. Moments later the forest erupted with shouts. Lucien burst through the trees at the head of nearly 20 estate guards. Even after 11 years, the sight of the kind Duke charging fearlessly into danger remained unforgettable. He leaped from his horse before it fully stopped, sword flashing as another wolf lunged toward Nathaniel. The blade struck the ground before the animal's paws, forcing the pack backward. Behind him, the guards formed a circle with blazing torches and raised rifles. Startled by fire, steel, and overwhelming numbers, the wolves retreated one by one into the storm-dark forest until only silence remained. Lucien embraced his son only briefly before helping free Eleanor from the tangled logs. Nathaniel lifted her carefully into his father's arms, but as Lucien looked down, his expression changed. Eleanor's face had become ghostly pale, and her pulse fluttered weakly beneath her wrist. By the time they reached Ashcombe Palace, physicians were already waiting. After hours behind closed doors, the eldest doctor emerged with eyes heavy from worry. The strain has severely weakened her heart, he said quietly. If another shock like today occurs, I fear she may not survive it. Nathaniel remained beside Eleanor's bed throughout the night, refusing food, sleep, or comfort. Watching from the doorway, Rosalie suddenly remembered another room years earlier, another patient wrapped in bandages after a terrible fire, and another frightened soul she had refused to leave. History, she realized, was no longer repeating itself by chance. It was leading them toward a danger far greater than any of them yet understood. Victor Blackmore understood that swords could be defeated, witnesses could be silenced, and criminals could be exposed, but a carefully planted lie often survived longer than truth itself. After Eleanor escaped his kidnappers and the failed ambush in the forest, he abandoned violence for something far more devastating. While Ashcomb's physicians struggled to strengthen Eleanor's fragile heart, Victor quietly gathered corrupt doctors, ambitious newspaper editors, and politicians whose loyalty had long ago been purchased with generous donations. Before a single shot could be fired again, he intended to destroy Eleanor's future with words instead of weapons. The attack began at sunrise. Every major newspaper across Britain carried the same alarming headline: Future Duchess hides deadly family illness. The articles claimed Eleanor suffered from an inherited disease that would inevitably claim her life before middle age. Worse still, fabricated medical reports insisted any children she bore would inherit the same fatal weakness. Anonymous physicians described her condition as hopeless. False experts warned that allowing such a woman to marry the future Duke would threaten the Ashcombe bloodline for generations. Within hours, Parliament demanded answers. Public opinion shifted with astonishing speed. People who had praised Eleanor's courage after the wolf attack now questioned her honesty. Wealthy families whispered that love should never outweigh duty. Noblewomen who had once envied her quietly smiled behind sympathetic expressions, convinced the scandal had ended Nathaniel's courtship forever. Eleanor read the newspapers only once. Then she folded them neatly and placed them into the fireplace. Nathaniel found her standing beside the dying flames. "They're lying," he said. "I know. They'll answer for this." She looked toward him with tired green eyes. "I'm not afraid for myself." She hesitated. "I'm afraid they'll convince you that loving me is selfish." Nathaniel crossed the room until only inches separated them. "When I was 9, people believed I could never become whole." He gently raised his empty sleeve. "They were wrong then." He softly touched her hand. "They're wrong now." News of the scandal reached Parliament before the week ended. A special committee summoned Duke Lucien to London, demanding that Ashcombe reconsider the future marriage. One elderly lord spoke with practiced politeness. "The nation respects your family, your grace." Lucien remained silent. But emotion cannot outweigh responsibility. Still silence. "If Miss Whitmore truly cannot produce healthy heirs." The Duke slowly stood. Every conversation stopped. "My son was told he would never walk properly." His voice remained calm. "He was told he would never lead." Another pause. "He was told no woman would ever truly love him." Lucien looked around the chamber. "Britain has been wrong before." He walked out before anyone could answer. Outside Parliament, Nathaniel waited. "I'll renounce my inheritance," he said quietly. Lucien stopped walking. "No. It would end this. It would reward evil." Nathaniel lowered his eyes. "I won't let Ashcombe suffer because of me." Lucien placed both hands firmly upon his son's shoulders. Everything your mother and I built exists, so you never have to apologize for who you are. Neither man spoke again during the journey home. Meanwhile, Rosalie's instincts refused to accept the official diagnosis. Too many details reminded her of the lies Sebastian had once created years earlier. Instead of trusting famous physicians, she traveled quietly to Eleanor's grandfather's secluded cottage carrying only a small leather notebook. The elderly doctor welcomed her with exhausted eyes. "I've reviewed every record," Rosalie explained. "Something doesn't fit." Together they examined years of prescriptions, handwritten notes, laboratory observations, and forgotten correspondence. Long after midnight, Eleanor's grandfather suddenly froze while studying faded pharmacy receipts. "No." Rosalie looked up. "What is it?" He spread dozens of bottles across the table. "My son never prescribed this medicine. But Eleanor took it for years." He stared in disbelief. "The labels are genuine." His hands began trembling. The medicine inside wasn't. Hours later they reached the horrifying truth. Victor's pharmaceutical company had quietly replaced Eleanor's legitimate heart medication with a slow-acting poison. The poison weakened her heartbeat gradually, created identical symptoms, destroyed her strength, made every physician believe her illness was natural. She had never been dying from inherited disease. Someone had been murdering her one dose at a time. Rosalie immediately sent word to Lucien. The Duke wasted no time. Search warrants uncovered hidden laboratories owned by Victor's companies. Secret ledgers listed bribed pharmacists throughout Britain. Warehouse records proved thousands of altered medicines had been distributed for years. Victor realized the investigation had finally reached him. He decided to retrieve the evidence before Parliament ever saw it. That evening Ashcombe Palace echoed with children's laughter as Charlotte, William, and little Emily played hide-and-seek beneath blooming apple trees. Rosalie and Eleanor prepared medicine inside the clinic while Nathaniel reviewed hospital accounts nearby. The laughter suddenly stopped. A terrified maid burst through the doorway. "The children?" Rosalie's face turned pale. "What happened?" "They're gone." The entire estate erupted into chaos. Small footprints ended beside the eastern gate where carriage tracks disappeared toward the river. Pinned beneath the garden gate hung a single envelope. Lucien unfolded it slowly. Inside lay one sentence. "Bring Edward Whitmore's evidence to the old Blackmore Medical Works, or bury your children instead." Nathaniel immediately recognized the abandoned factory. It stood beside the river where Victor had manufactured defective medical equipment years earlier before moving operations elsewhere. Lucien drew his revolver. Nathaniel tightened his sword belt using one practiced hand. Neither man waited for reinforcements. Father and son rode together beneath gathering storm clouds toward the deserted factory. Smoke already drifted above its towering chimneys. By the time they reached the riverbank, flames glowed through shattered windows while frightened cries echoed from somewhere inside the collapsing building. Lucien looked toward Nathaniel. The young heir met his father's eyes without speaking. Neither needed words. Years earlier, one father had raced into fire to save the woman who rescued his son. Now, father and son stood together before an inferno that threatened 3 innocent children. As the first explosion shook the abandoned factory and shattered every remaining window, Nathaniel whispered only 4 words before charging through the burning entrance beside his father. "Not our family again." The abandoned Blackmore Medical Works trembled beneath roaring flames as Duke Lucien and Nathaniel disappeared into the burning building. Thick smoke poured through broken windows while exploding boilers hurled sparks across collapsing walkways. Years of corruption seemed to burn alongside the factory itself, but somewhere inside, 3 frightened children waited. Lucien ignored the blistering heat, shouting Charlotte, William, and Emily's names through choking smoke. Nathaniel stayed beside him despite the fierce pain radiating through his weakened leg. Neither father nor son cared about danger anymore. They had survived too much together to lose their family now. The factory had once produced medical equipment for hospitals across Britain. Now rusted machinery lined flooded corridors where boiling water burst from cracked pipes. Twisted metal blocked passageways, forcing Lucien and Nathaniel deeper into the labyrinth. Every few moments another explosion shook the walls. Burning beams crashed behind them, trapping every escape route except forward. Then they heard it. "Father." Charlotte's frightened voice echoed somewhere above them. Nathaniel immediately recognized the direction. The upper assembly floor. They climbed a narrow iron staircase just as another blast ripped through the lower level. Molten pipes burst apart, sending steam hissing across the room. Reaching the second floor, they found Charlotte, William, and little Emily locked inside an old storage room. Heavy chains secured the doors from outside while flames crept across the wooden ceiling. Lucien fired once. The lock shattered. Before the children could run free, another violent explosion tore apart the support beams beneath them. The floor collapsed. Charlotte screamed as she slipped toward the opening. Nathaniel lunged without hesitation. Using his single arm, he caught his little sister's wrist just before she disappeared into the inferno below. Pain surged through his shoulder as he struggled to hold her weight. "I've got you." William immediately grabbed Charlotte's other arm while Lucien pulled Emily safely behind him. Together they lifted Charlotte back onto solid ground. Tears streamed down her face as she threw herself against Nathaniel. "I knew you'd come." He kissed her forehead. "We always will." The building groaned again. Lucien looked upward. The roof. Large burning beams crashed across the hallway, cutting off their only exit. Smoke thickened until breathing became almost impossible. Nathaniel quickly scanned the room, remembering the old factory plans he had studied during the investigation. One possibility remained. The river tunnel. Lucien nodded instantly. Together they led the children toward an abandoned maintenance shaft descending beneath the factory. Floodwater rushed through the narrow tunnel while burning debris crashed behind them. Emily stumbled repeatedly across slippery stones, so Nathaniel lifted her into his arms despite already carrying Charlotte's weight moments earlier. His injured leg trembled beneath the strain, but he refused to slow. At the tunnel's end, daylight finally appeared. One by one they emerged onto the muddy riverbank just as the entire factory collapsed behind them in a thunderous explosion. Towering flames climbed into the evening sky while twisted steel crashed into the flooded river. Estate guards surrounded the family moments later. Rosalie reached her children first, embracing all three so tightly that none could speak through joyful tears. Eleanor stood nearby, her face pale with worry until Nathaniel stepped safely into the fading sunlight. Only then did she allow herself to cry. Victor attempted escape aboard a waiting carriage hidden beyond the riverside trees. He almost succeeded. Lucien mounted his horse once more and pursued him across the flooded countryside. The chase ended before sunrise when Victor reached a fallen bridge blocked by soldiers already alerted through Ashcombe's network. Surrounded with nowhere left to run, the man who had spent decades believing wealth could purchase immunity finally lowered his weapon. Days later, Parliament assembled inside the crowded Great Hall. This time Victor stood not as a celebrated philanthropist but as a prisoner. Hidden ledgers, poison medicines, bribed physicians, forged reports, murdered witnesses. Every crime unfolded before the nation. Eleanor's grandfather presented the journals preserved by his son. Rosalie demonstrated how Victor's company had replaced genuine medicine with slow-acting poison. Respected physicians confirmed Eleanor had never inherited a fatal illness. She had been poisoned for years. The chamber fell silent. The same politicians who had condemned Eleanor only weeks earlier lowered their heads in shame. Victor Blackmore was stripped of every title, every estate, every company, and sentenced to spend the remainder of his life imprisoned for murder, fraud, conspiracy, and treason against the crown through knowingly endangering British hospitals. Justice had finally arrived. Spring returned once more to Ashcombe. Months passed. Proper treatment slowly restored Eleanor's strength. Color returned to her cheeks. Her heartbeat steadied. For the first time since childhood she walked through the gardens without pain stealing her breath. Every improvement felt like another life being returned to her. To honor her late father, Lucien and Rosalie rebuilt the abandoned medical academy using Victor's confiscated fortune. The institution welcomed physicians from across Britain regardless of wealth or social standing. Its purpose was simple. Every patient deserved honest medicine, and every doctor deserved truthful science. The opening ceremony filled the estate with guests from every county. Doctors, teachers, soldiers, farmers, children, servants, nobles. Everyone stood together beneath blooming white roses. Nathaniel stepped onto the platform where his father had once announced a bride competition years before. Looking across the crowd, he smiled gently. "When I was 9 years old," he began, "I believed people would only remember the arm I had lost." The audience listened in complete silence. Then someone knelt beside me to help tie my shoe. His eyes found Rosalie. "She taught me kindness changes generations." He turned toward Eleanor. "For years I searched for someone who would see me before my disability." He slowly descended the platform. Standing before Eleanor, he knelt despite the murmurs filling the garden. Taking both her hands carefully within his own, he said, I spent years believing I was incomplete. A soft smile touched Eleanor's face. You never were. Nathaniel's eyes filled with tears. Will you spend every day God gives us walking beside me? She gently touched the sleeve pinned against his shoulder. I never counted what was missing. Her voice trembled. I only saw the man whose heart was always whole. Yes. Applause erupted throughout the gardens. Lucien quietly wiped tears from his eyes while Rosalie leaned against him, smiling through joyful tears of her own. Charlotte, William, and Emily cheered louder than anyone, racing forward to embrace Nathaniel and Eleanor together. Several months later, beneath the very same white rose garden where Lucien and Rosalie had married years before, Nathaniel and Eleanor exchanged vows. Instead of requesting expensive royal gifts, they asked every guest to donate books, wheelchairs, prosthetic limbs, medicines, and school supplies for disabled children throughout Britain. Hundreds accepted gladly. The former stable boy, now Ashcombe's respected estate manager, proudly welcomed guests at the entrance, remembering the day Rosalie had saved his future with nothing more than truth and compassion. Years passed peacefully. Then another surprise arrived. Eleanor was expecting a child. The newspapers that had once declared she could never bear healthy children suddenly filled with anxious speculation. Some physicians quietly predicted tragedy. Others warned Nathaniel to prepare for heartbreak. Memories of Victor's lies still haunted many minds despite his conviction. Rosalie refused to let fear enter Ashcombe again. She remained beside Eleanor every day, encouraging her exactly as she had once encouraged a frightened little boy learning to trust himself. Lucien watched quietly, recognizing history repeating once more, though this time love stood where fear had once ruled. One peaceful autumn night, labor began. Hours stretched endlessly while the entire family waited outside the bedroom. Nathaniel paced the hallway until even his injured leg could carry him no farther. Lucien placed a reassuring hand upon his shoulder, remembering another long night decades earlier when he had feared losing everything. At dawn, the bedroom door finally opened. The physician stepped into the hallway smiling through happy tears. Congratulations. Nathaniel scarcely breathed. You have healthy twins. A beautiful baby girl. And a strong baby boy. For a heartbeat nobody moved. Then joy burst through the corridor. Nathaniel entered the room trembling. Eleanor smiled weakly from the bed while placing one tiny infant into each of his arms. Looking down at his sleeping son and daughter, tears streamed freely down his face. Lucien wrapped an arm around Rosalie and whispered, "The kindness you showed one lonely child has become an inheritance no lie could ever destroy." Years later, travelers crossing England spoke of Ashcombe not as the estate where 50 women once competed for a crown, but as the home where one woman knelt to help a disabled boy tie his shoe, where that boy grew into a noble man who found love through the same quiet kindness, and where two healthy twins proved forever that prejudice, fear, and cruelty can wound the human heart, but they can never overcome truth, compassion, and love passed faithfully from one generation to the next.